This program is recorded and presented by Chippewa Valley Community Television.
Welcome to From the Newsroom, production of the Western Wisconsin Press Club in cooperation with Chippewa Valley Community Television. I'm Henry Lippold. Well, candidates seeking nomination for president are pressed by reporters about what they would do in the Middle East if elected. Today, I welcome back Wallace Rogers of Wallace Rogers and Associates, who has worked in Iraq and other nations in the area. And Wallace, it's good to have you back here for your ability to shed light on the complex issues there in the Middle East. But before we begin that discussion, briefly, what was your job in Iraq?
In Iraq, I actually had 3 different types of contracts. It was mostly to train up the local government officials. A lot of job coaching, capacity building, those kinds of things, because what we sought to do after the Gulf War in Iraq was to decentralize these governments as best we could. So the theory being, and it's pretty proven, I think, that decentralized governments tend to be more democratic than top-down governments. And so the tradition in Iraq for years and years, as you know, was a top-down dictatorship, and before that, dictators, and before that, a king. And so this was quite different after we invaded Iraq. There was a lot of putting pieces back together again.
Well, it must feel kind of bad to have that go down the drain, so to speak.
Yeah, it's been difficult. It's the same things happened in Afghanistan to us, and I've worked in Afghanistan a little bit too. So it's but it's we've got some really good people on the ground. We hope we've trained who hope that they can survive the politics here and get into leadership positions.
Now, when you were on this program in 2014, ISIS was just beginning to sweep into Iraq and had taken over Mosul and some other smaller cities. Yes. Where are they now?
Well, on this map, as you can see, the tan area, tannish or pink area right here.
Let's see. There it is.
Okay. That's the area that's controlled by ISIS.
A big chunk.
A big chunk in the middle. Most of it down here, like in Anbar province, is desert. But there are some big cities, as you said. Mosul is the second biggest city in Iraq, and that's controlled by ISIS. And Ramadi there's battles going on there right now for the Iraqi government to push ISIS out of Iraq. And in Tikrit here, the same kind of thing. A few months ago, there was a major offensive in Tikrit to push ISIS out, which had kind of mixed results.
And the Kurds?
Yeah, the Kurds are up here, and this is technically part of Iraq. But ever since the first Gulf War, it's really been kind of an autonomous region. The Kurds are a different ethnic group than the Sunnis and the Shiite Muslims, which live in the rest of Iraq. And since early 1990s, they've been fairly independent, well developed, and ISIS, as you might see, ISIS came right up to the border of Erbil, which is the capital here, and the Kurdish militia called the Peshmerga really fought them back, and the Peshmerga is kind of holding its own against ISIS right now. And
where does Turkey fit in?
Turkey is right up here and borders on Syria and Kurdistan, and they're players in this process too, because they want to make sure that they have a really conflicted relationship with Kurdistan because there are lots of Kurds in Turkey, and if Kurdistan becomes an independent country like they want it, like the Kurds want it to be, the Turkish government's afraid that that Kurdish minority, which is just north of Kurdistan here, will be a civil war in Turkey, and they'll secede and try to join Kurdistan.
Now, there's supposed to be a 65-nation coalition dealing with some of these issues. But have you heard of anything it's done?
Well, I think as far as military action, I think the Saudis, which are kind of leading the 65-member coalition, have been involved militarily, I think, in Yemen, which is on the Saudi peninsula, farther south here. There's Saudi Arabia, but farther south. But the coalition has mostly been supplying some of the money to support the rebels, not the ISIS rebels, the rebels in Syria who are against the Assad regime, which was the government that was in place there when the Civil War started a couple of years ago. And but they're not providing too many troops.
Well, you mentioned Assad. Let's talk about what's going on in Syria. And so maybe you can straighten that out. Who's supporting him? Who's not supporting him?
Yeah, the man who is nominally the president of Syria right now, he's the son of a former dictator. So there's been a dictatorship in Syria for a long time.
That would be Assad.
Yeah, that's Assad. And when all that, they called it the Arab Spring, when things happened in Tunisia and Algeria and Egypt, they also happened in Syria, and people kind of rose up against this dictatorship, and a civil war started. And then it got way out of hand and out of control, because now the Russians are involved, and the U.S., of course, is doing some airstrikes here, and ISIS is there, and it's really quite a mess. As you can see, Syria's right about here, and it's all split up between all these organizations. The pro-democracy rebels hold a little bit of the area. Assad holds a little bit down here by Damascus, the capital, in the south, and the Kurds hold a big chunk in the northeast.
Well, one of the things is that I heard about is that Iran is helping Assad, but also trying to take out the ISIS people.
Yeah, ISIS. All the mess going way back to when we invaded Iraq kind of deals with two factions of the Muslim religion, Shiites and Sunnis. Sunnis are about 85% of Muslims are Sunnis. Only 15% are Shias. But Shias are a majority in Iraq. They're a majority in Iran. And a sect of the Shiites is the Assad family, who are running Syria. So when Iraq, after Saddam was overthrown, and we had that power vacuum there after we started pulling out, Iran, being a Shiite country, came in to help their cousins, and they have a lot of influence with the Iraqi government right now. The Iraqi government, prime minister and the majority in the parliament are Shiites. That upset the Sunnis. Hassan was a Sunni, Saddam Hussein, right. And they ran the place. Well, everybody knows what kind of a leader he was, and so it was payback time after Saddam Hussein was overthrown, and they never really, the Sunnis in Iraq and the Shiites in Iraq never really assimilated. When ISIS came along, the Sunnis, who are mostly up in this area, right up here, the Shias are down here, they weren't too unhappy to see ISIS come along, because they pushed the government out of that area. And a lot of the tribes and the sheikhs made arrangements with ISIS and supported them, and that kind of helped ease them into a lot of these cities along the Euphrates and Tigris rivers, big cities like Mosul, Tikrit, Ramadi, Fallujah. They're actually quite close to Baghdad and quite close to Erbil, which is the capital of Kurdistan.
Well, I know most of us know about some of the deeds that the ISIS people have been doing, very bad by our standards, cutting off heads and other outlandish by our standards things. But I've heard that some people rather like them.
Well, apparently, from what I've heard too, is they're picking up. They've got systems in place to pick up the garbage and keep the stormwater drained off the streets, and those really basic services that we take for granted, which affect your quality of life. They've been very draconian about how they're paying for it. I mean, everybody goes in and pays a tribute, like a property tax. Except it's a head tax, I think, to ISIS. But some of it they use to provide basic services. I don't think, and again, I have some friends who are here in this area, but of course I can't communicate with them now. But I wouldn't be surprised. I don't think they expected ISIS to be as harsh as they've been in their interpretation of Islamic laws and those kinds of things. And the popular notion is that ISIS is really they're religious zealots, but they're more like a gang, like the mob, I guess, than they are a religious sect, because they're making a lot of money off the oil in here.
That's where they get it.
Oil, those kinds of things. So, yeah.
So if they lost that territory, that would probably make a big change in what's happening.
Yeah, I think it would, because they'd have to get their income from other sources, and that's mostly where they get it from here, is the trade that they've affected with these people around them. I mean, Turkey doesn't like ISIS too much, but they trade with them. Turkey doesn't like the Kurds too much, but they trade with them too. So there's lots of commerce back and forth here.
Well, it's all kind of hard for us to understand.
Yeah.
Well, perhaps you can, you can answer this question about some deaths in Iraq. That they've had some explosions and attacks there. Who's attacking who in Iraq?
Well, I think there's some. Again, there's this tension between the Kurds and the Shiites is still there.
Still there.
And towards the time when we were leaving Iraq, when I was there, it really played itself out. They were killing each other. They each had militias, and lots of places in Baghdad. And it was not unusual to hear explosions every night and those kinds of things, and be, and to be locked up in our compound where we couldn't move around too much. But so there are those kinds of that
Still
kind of
going
recent
on.
history still going on. But it's ISIS and Al Qaeda. I think Al Qaeda is still a player here, that are doing some of the stuff in Baghdad that you read about, and that's mostly, at least in this region, where you hear about these bombs and things. There is in Baghdad and maybe up here in Kirkuk, but that's the Sunni Shia thing, I think, still happening.
Now, you've told me that some people who did the work you were doing have been killed.
Yeah, we had, when I was there, when we had a big military presence there were people getting kidnapped, like we worked with a woman who was the dean of the law school at the University in Mosul, and she was kidnapped and killed. Some of our translators were threatened. In fact, I still pretty regularly write these recommendations for special visas so that people who worked for us can get out because they're threatened. It's a special kind of visa where you go to the front of the line and to get out of Iraq. So I've written a few of those. I don't know how that's turned out, except in a couple cases. And a lot of the people that we trained and we worked with have gone up here to Kurdistan, where it's much more secure and have more opportunities.
Well, Turkey, let's talk about them for just a minute. Is their border porous, as we sometimes hear?
It's very, very mountainous all along here. This whole region is mountainous, so there's not too many. The urban areas are very small villages, so just like you can walk across the Canadian border in the upper Midwest, except that's flat. This is hilly up here, but it's still sparsely populated like that. So it would be, yeah, I think it'd be pretty easy to get back and forth across the border.
Well, is Iraq becoming a workable country, a democracy?
No, we always thought, at least I always thought, that maybe this Kurdish area, it's a semi-autonomous region. Right now they have their own flag, their own passport control, and that sort of thing. But they were always considered part of Iraq. I think Iraq, this is half their territory here. It's mostly desert, but they've lost half their territory to ISIS, not counting Kurdistan. And and they're right on the door here, the Baghdad, doorstep here in Baghdad. So I don't think it looks too good for Iraq. We always thought maybe that Iraq would, a few of us anyway, thought it would split into three areas, three kind of autonomous regions: Kurdistan, the Sunni area here, and then the Shiite area, where they work in, they join together in some kind of a confederation. But that never happened. They're still trying to run a central government out of Baghdad, but they got no influence here, very little influence up here.
Well, let's move on to Afghanistan. What's the situation there?
Well, I hate to be the bearer of bad news here, but as gloomy as it sounds in Iraq, it's kind of worse in Afghanistan, because in Iraq they've got a really educated middle class. At least they had it at the time of our invasion. A lot of people have left now, but Afghanistan is very, very tribal, even more than Iraq, and so they're dealing with that as they try to, between two big factions, try to set up a government. They had an election about a year and a half ago that was really disputed. Finally got worked out, and the new president of Afghanistan is, you don't read too much about him because he's not too powerful. And you have not so much ISIS, but Al Qaeda is back in, and they've been fighting a civil war. And there are lots of no-go areas when I've been in Afghanistan, provinces I couldn't go into because they were controlled by Al Qaeda or sheikhs that allied with Al Qaeda, so we weren't too welcome in those places. So we've got a lot of troops there, almost 10,000 troops still.
Yes.
But I think they're mostly crowded around the big air base north of Kabul, and a couple of other places like down in Kandahar in the southwestern part, and up by the capital.
So they're supposed to, as I understand it, stand behind the indigenous forces and help them out. And how does that work out?
Well, we've mostly been, I spent a lot of time when I was there on the military bases, and you could always these bases that we established there. You could also always see the training going on. We were training a lot of Afghan army people. I've heard that hasn't gone too well, but that's mostly the big activity we're doing there, plus a few special forces going out with the Afghan army actually into some of these areas that are being contested right now with Al Qaeda.
Now we also hear that the Taliban is in action in Afghanistan. Can you tell us about that?
Well, Taliban ran Afghanistan before we went in after 9/11, and we chased the Taliban out, but we chased them over to Pakistan, really. But they've always had a presence there, and the Afghans have been struggling with how to integrate the Taliban into the government, and there have been talks going on for years and years about that, but they haven't gotten any place. But the Taliban their mission is to take Afghanistan over again and take it back, and so they've been quite active in the rural areas, especially.
Well, now we know that they've committed some bad things recently. TV journalists, 7 of them were killed in an attack on a bus, and at the university, a Taliban attack killed at least 20 persons. What are they trying to prove?
Well, again, they're a terrorist organization, so they want to make the locals, the people who live in the Afghans, feel like things are quite unstable and the government, the elected government can't really control anything. And of course they want to send a message to people in the United States too, in the government of the United States, saying this place is untenable. I mean, you guys can stay here forever if you want to, but you're not going to change anything. We're always going to be here. And so it's that's what those terror attacks are about.
So do you think our military there in Afghanistan is just wasting its time, more or less?
I think as long as we're training troops and you know, I've been on the civilian side of things. I haven't been on the military side of things. I don't know really how that's going. But if it's if they're making progress there, it's probably good, because the Afghans are going to have to be able to control Afghanistan if they're ever going to have a semi-democratic government or become a stable government. I don't know how many troops it takes to do that, but I think it would be a mistake to go in like we did in 2004 into Iraq with lots and lots of troops, tens of thousands of troops.
Yes.
Because I don't think that would really solve anything. I mean, things would be quiet as long as we were sitting there. But as soon as we left, which is what's happened in both places, all these simmering things are going to come to a boil, and they're going to have to be dealt with again.
Many of the candidates for nomination would like more troops on the ground.
Yeah.
Good idea?
Well, you know, you got to go back to, that's not ancient history. It's Iraq, you know, just a few years ago. We should have learned lessons there. We learned lessons in Vietnam. We learned a little bit about Iraq, is we can't go in and impose our will on places that have all these long-standing things, rivalries and disputes going on, that have only been quieted because they had a top-down government with a pretty severe dictator. You know, unless we plan to be there for a long, long, long time, I don't think the military option is a good one.
Well, maybe they're listening to you. Meanwhile, there's thousands of people fleeing from the area, especially Syria.
Yeah.
What do you know about that?
Well, about 4.5 million people, which is a big chunk of the population of Syria, has left Syria. And that's probably mostly the middle class, which is unfortunate. I mean, a large part of them, most of them are going to Europe. Only about 1,700, I think, have immigrated to the United States. Lots more to Canada. I don't know if they plan on going back soon, because everybody, at least the local people, the people really familiar with this, think this is going to go on for a long time, and it's really untenable to try to live in this situation where you've got a three-way civil war going on.
Well, is it okay, or is it proper to think that there'd be some bad persons, that's a funny name, in the group that comes over?
Oh, I think so. So that's why you have to be very careful to vet them, but I don't think you can just say that a majority or a big percentage of those refugees are ISIS people or Al-Qaeda or terrorists or something like that. And most of them are families just trying to get out of a situation that we can't even imagine.
But as we've learned, it doesn't take too many to cause some heavy damage to lives and property.
I think recent history in the United States has shown that the last few things that have gotten a lot of press anyway have been homegrown terrorists. I mean, people who are influenced by radical Islam and this special interpretation of Islam. But they're people that have been in the United States for a long time.
Now, we sometimes hear about government corruption in those states.
Yeah.
Is there a lot of it? Did you see it?
Yes, there is. Again, the tradition in Iraq and Afghanistan is a top-down government. So what you have to do is, to do most anything, you have to get permission from a national ministry or a representative of a national ministry. And there's a, and I can't remember the term in Arabic in Iraq, but it was whenever we would plan on spending money, we would always figure out how much we needed, and we multiplied times 25% because that's what you had to pay in order to get the approvals that you needed up and down the line. Same thing happened in Afghanistan, so it's it's a frustrating situation, but it's the way business has been done for years and years and years there, and the locals don't seem to mind it. They see it as the cost of doing business.
I don't see how you deal with that,
No.
especially when you come from Western nations.
Yeah, and we want to be very careful because we don't want to use our foreign aid money that are going into this to pay bribes to people. And so you want to be effective, though. You want to get things done.
Getting back to the refugees, there are some countries that give humanitarian support, not military, but I think they're in that coalition.
Yeah.
And the U.S. Defense Secretary would like a little more than humanitarian help, but
Yeah, that's kind of what I was involved in. I was on the government side and training up local government officials, but it was humanitarian work. There were lots of people, Doctors Without Borders, those kinds of organizations going in and helping with the health care and all those kinds of things that it takes to improve the quality of life. But again, that's pretty effective on the local level. You make lots of friends. I mean, good friends, and you meet a lot of very interesting and talented people when you do that. But when it percolates up to the top, there aren't any Nelson Mandelas in Afghanistan or Iraq. At least I haven't heard of any. And that's what you really need. Is you need somebody who has a big following who will come up and say, forget about the way we did things before. This is how we're going to do it now, and let's not look backwards. Let's look forward. But that's not happened yet.
there's no leader who's ready to step forward and walk.
Apparently not. No, not that anybody's aware of.
Well, Wallace Rogers, thank you very much for taking time out of your busy schedule to be with us today. We appreciate your knowledge and your insight.
Oh, thanks, Henry, for inviting me.
This program was recorded and presented by Chippewa Valley Community Television.